Right guys, welcome back to another video, and today we are going to be discussing one of the biggest and most famous stadiums in Australia, its history and what the future may hold for this stadium, and that is of course Stadium Australia, currently known as Accor Stadium. Now this was built way back in the late 90s for the Sydney Olympics in the year 2000. The construction cost right around $690 million back then, which is equivalent these days to around $1.3 billion in 2024 terms. And when it did open back in 1999, it did have a massive capacity of 115,000, and you can see here from the images at that time those two open stands exposed behind each goal, and they are absolutely massive, guys. Extremely steep, no coverage from the elements, but the plan here always was for these to be temporary and for the stadium to receive a renovation after the Olympics to make it more suitable for the sports that would be played there on an ongoing basis. And when this did open in that old configuration, it did get some massive crowds back in the 99 and early 2000 years. So the first event was an NRL doubleheader which got 104,000 people, and they also got, for two Bledisloe Cup games, Australia versus New Zealand in rugby, 107 and 109k respectively. And we all know rugby these days would not draw anywhere near as much as that, which does go to show how far the game has fallen from relevance in Australian society in recent years. And the biggest crowd they did sort of get in that period was for the 1999 NRL Grand Final, 108,000. But obviously after the Olympics they did renovate this for $80 million, and the main feature of the renovation was that they closed in both of the ends and put that overhang over the top. And they also converted the seats on the wing to be movable, so the stadium could actually be set up in either an oval or a rectangular configuration. And that was largely due to lobbying from the AFL, because at the time the SCG held around 40,000 or slightly less. So they did want a bigger stadium where they could play those big games and finals. So the decision was made not to convert the stadium permanently into a rectangular configuration, but to have those movable seats. So the capacity is 84,000 in the rectangular configuration and around 82.5 in the oval configuration. And initially the AFL did get some massive crowds here for the Swans. They got around 73,000 for a home and away game against Collingwood in 2003, and over 70,000 for a preliminary final in the same year. But through the later years in the 2000s and the early 2010s, the crowds really fell off for the AFL, and the Swans pivoted back to wanting to play all their games at the SCG as that sort of got redeveloped and upgraded through the years. So currently there isn't really any cricket or Aussie rules football played at the facility. They did play a few T20 games, and the Sydney Thunder in the Big Bash did play there, but the crowds weren't great. So after around 12 years from when the stadium was converted into its current form, there was a proposal back in 2015 for the stadium to receive a $250 million renovation, which included a retractable roof. And you can see here on the renderings, it is sort of semi-transparent. You do have that sort of frame design, structural support along the roof, which would create some pretty bad shadows, you would think, for day games. And there was also a proposal as part of this plan to install some movable curtains which would block off the upper levels when there is a low demand sport being played, like an NRL regular season game. When you only have 10 or 15,000 people in an 80,000 plus seat venue, looks really bad. So that would effectively block off all those empty seats in the upper deck. But this did not end up happening. And you might remember a couple of years later, the New South Wales government and Gladys Berejiklian, who was the Premier at the time, came out and said, listen, we're going to rebuild all the stadiums in the city of Sydney. So that included Stadium Australia, the Sydney Football Stadium next to the SCG, and also Parramatta Stadium, which is called CommBank Stadium now. And the plan for Stadium Australia was a complete knockdown and rebuild of a new 75,000 seat stadium on the site. You can see the renderings here, quite a nice design. Sort of reminds me of Optus Stadium in Perth with that exterior. You do have a nice roof that covers a majority of the seating, although it is not a fully enclosed stadium. And you could sort of argue the wing areas look the same, but obviously behind the goals there, they have built it up a lot more. So it does create a more intimate atmosphere. It's a much more modern design, you would say, compared to the current stadium. But people were pissed at this proposal. At that point, the stadium was only 18 years old and the cost was massive, obviously with 3 new stadiums, including the Parramatta and Sydney football stadiums. And the estimated cost on this at the time was $1.25 billion. So that did not go down well with the taxpayer. And the government listened to that, and the next year they backflipped and said, look, we'll do an $800 million renovation instead. We'll reduce the capacity down to 70,000 and we will convert it into a permanent rectangular configuration. At this point, AFL and cricket are basically never played here, so it does make sense to go down the path of making this a permanent rectangular stadium, given the sporting preferences for the city of Sydney. The estimated cost on this, $800 million instead of 1.25, so obviously it's a big saving. And all in all, you'd probably argue that potentially this was a better option. However, it did not end up happening because, as we know, in the year 2020, because of the pandemic, the government really cut back on a lot of non-essential spending. So they did effectively bin this idea, and as at 2024, the stadium does sit the same, more or less, as it has been for the past 20 years. And unfortunately, apart from about 5 events a year, the stadium is completely obsolete. Now, we only really see it full for State of Origin, NRL Grand Final, the occasional soccer game, the occasional big concert. At this point, rugby union is more or less irrelevant in Australia, and the majority of the time when we do see this stadium, it's hosting, 10 or 20,000 people at an NRL game, which really does not look good. And the stadium's now 25 years old, and the New South Wales government has really got to ask the question, what do we do with this stadium? Do we give it a big scale renovation around $1 billion like it was proposed back in 2017, 2018 to give it another 20, 25 years of life before we bulldoze it? Or do we just bite the bullet now, bulldoze it, build a new stadium, translucent roof, all the best social spaces and modern amenities that you are going to get, like with some of those super stadiums over in the USA. There's a big focus on plenty of natural light, plenty of social spaces for people to congregate, bar and restaurant areas. And I would expect in the city of Sydney, due to the construction costs, that would be around $2.53 billion, given the cost of construction, inflation, all the other aspects of it. The one advantage you would have with the site is that it's already connected with a lot of infrastructure in terms of public transport, getting people in and out. So you wouldn't have to factor in that. We know with Optus Stadium in Perth, it did cost right around $1.8 billion for a 60,000 seat venue, but they did have to invest in all of the infrastructure around the ground, including the transportation network, a new train station, etc. But you have to remember, at this point, that was 10 years ago. So building a new 75, 80,000 seat stadium in Sydney, you are definitely looking at north of $2.5 billion for sure. In terms of the location itself, it is a long way out of the city, around 20 kilometres to the west. But we know Sydney is a very spread out city, and this stadium effectively acts as sort of a Western Sydney base rather than a CBD base. So you could argue the location's not too bad. There's really no room to build an 80,000 seat stadium around Sydney City itself. So it does make sense to build on the site of the current stadium. And it's sort of an interesting situation because, as we said, the stadium is effectively obsolete for 90% of the year, but Sydney's so famous. It is the most famous city in Australia. At this point, it is still the most populated city in Australia, depending on how you look at it in terms of metro area with Melbourne. And if it wants to keep the big events, which we know it does, I mean, Sydney builds itself as sort of the entertainment capital of Australia, you do need a modern big stadium, 70, 80,000 plus, if you want to keep the Taylor Swift concerts, the NRL Grand Finals, etc. Because you could make the argument, look, we do already have the Parramatta CommBank Stadium and the Sydney Football Stadium, so why do we need 3 large stadiums? But if you do want to compete with the MCG and even Optus Stadium at this point, you are going to need a 70, 80,000 seater in Sydney. So it is a big call for the government to make, but they really need to come out in the next year or two and really put the flag in the ground and make the decision. Because if this stadium's allowed to rot for another 10 years, it'll get to the point where you can't renovate and they will have to bulldoze it and build a new one. And if we're talking construction costs in Sydney in 2035, I mean, this could be $5 billion at that point. So in my opinion, at this stage, if they're not going to renovate it in the next 2 years, you're going to have to bulldoze it and build a brand new state-of-the-art stadium that is fitting of a city of Sydney's size and stature. But anyway, guys, that is all we're going to have time for today. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to subscribe.